Part 3 of Federalist 53. I'll start at the beginning of paragraph 3 again. Paragraph 4. No man can be a competent legislator who does not add to an upright intention and a sound judgment a certain degree of knowledge of the subjects on which he is to legislate. A part of his knowledge may be acquired by means of information which lie within the compass of men in private as well as public stations. Another part can be attained, or at least thoroughly attained by actual experience in the station which requires the use of it. The period of service ought, therefore, in all such cases, to bear some portion to the extent of practical knowledge requisite to the due performance of the service. The period of legislative service established in most of the states for the more numerous branch is, as we have seen, 1 year. The question then may be put into this simple form. Does the period of 2 years bear no greater proportion to the knowledge requisite for federal legislation than 1 year does to the knowledge requisite for state legislation? The very statement of this question in this form suggests the answer that ought to be given to it. So obviously, if majority of states have elections once a year for their lower house of representatives, for their lower house or lower house in the legislature, so with the size of the country, with the population, then it just naturally makes sense to have one every 2 years. Now, I told you about the beginning of this paragraph in the last section, in the last 2 previous sections of this Federalist, how important it is that it talks about people of upright intention and sound judgment. Okay? People can gain knowledge, but knowledge is not sufficient. You have to have the upright intention and sound judgment to be able to work for the betterment of your society, the betterment of your community. Next paragraph. In a single state, the requisite knowledge relates to the existing laws which are uniform throughout the state and with which all the citizens are more or less conversant, and to the general affairs of the state, which lie within a small compass, are not very diversified and occupy much the attention and conversation of every class of people. The greater theater of the United States presents a very different scene. So the vastness of the United States creates a new necessity. That's why we're talking about biennial elections. The laws are so far from being uniform that they vary in every state, whilst the public affairs of the Union are spread throughout a very extensive region and are extremely diversified by the local affairs connected with them, and can with difficulty be correctly learned in any other place than in the central councils, to which a knowledge of them will be brought by the representatives of every part of the empire. Remember, again, I use the word empire. He uses this word empire just like he said earlier, a very extensive region. He doesn't mean it in an imperial sense, dominating other countries or so. So he says all the knowledge, like when they go to the capital, people who are from South Carolina, from Georgia, from North Carolina, Virginia, each one of them will take the knowledge that they have regarding their region, and when they get together, they can share this knowledge for the betterment of their country, to make better decisions. Yet some knowledge of the affairs and even of the laws of all the states ought to be possessed by the members from each of the states. How can foreign trade be properly regulated by uniform laws without some acquaintance with the commerce, the ports, the usages, and the regulations of the different states? How can the trade between the different states be duly regulated without some knowledge of their relative situations in these and other points? How can taxes be judiciously imposed and effectually collected if they be not accommodated in the different laws and local circumstances relating to these objects in the different states? How can uniform regulations for the militia be duly provided without a similar knowledge of some internal circumstances by which the states are distinguished from each other? There are the principal objects of federal legislation and suggest most forcibly the extensive information which the representatives ought to acquire. The other inferior objects will require a proportional degree of information with regard to them. The next paragraph: it is true that all these difficulties will, by degrees, be very much diminished as these representatives get together in the House of Representatives. They become familiar with each other's issues, and these problems will gradually be solved and lessened, diminished. The most laborious task will be the proper inauguration of the government and the primeval formation of the federal code. Primeval means the very basic first laws that are passed, those general laws that are going to be important in the first Congress. Like, for example, they passed that important Judiciary Act of 1789, and they worked on the Bill of Rights. So he says, once we get those behind us in the very first and second Congress, primeval, the beginnings, then everything will be easier. Improvements on the first draft will every year become both easier and fewer. Past transactions of the government will be a ready and accurate source of information to new members. The affairs of the Union will become more and more objects of curiosity and conversation among the citizens at large, and the increased intercourse among those of different states will contribute not a little to diffuse a mutual knowledge of their affairs, spreading the knowledge of different states amongst each other, amongst themselves, amongst one another. So when you diffuse knowledge, North Carolina representative will say what's special about some of the legislations they need, South Carolina, Virginia. So all this knowledge is going to be diffused, spread out. Different members will learn about them. As this again will contribute to a general assimilation of their manners and laws. But with all these abatements, the business of federal legislation must continue so far to exceed, both in novelty and difficulty, the legislative business of a single state as to justify the longer period of service assigned to those who are to transact it. So reasonably, you'll gather that 2 years would be a good length of time for them, for members of the House of Representatives to serve and to go up for re-election. That's 2 years. They will learn more about different parts of the country, and then this knowledge will be diffused, spread. Even if they don't stay in office, that accumulated knowledge can be passed to the next representative, to the next delegation. So again, focus on how vast this country was when you realize that they used to go around with buggies and horses, and there was no roads. So if you don't keep that in mind, then this issue of 1 year, 2 years, 6 months will not make any sense. Like I told you in one of the other parts, it took 6 days to get from one part of where the state of Maine is now to Massachusetts for just a short distance. And you can imagine how much it would take for somebody from Georgia go all the way up here to where Washington, D.C. is right now.